The thunder rolled across the plains as Grace Simmons clutched her 3-month-old daughter to her chest, the infant's soft whimpers nearly lost in the howling wind. The battered wooden sign ahead read Cottonwood Springs, and Grace's heart pounded wildly as she approached the dusty frontier town. Her shoes were worn through, her dress torn and mud spattered, and the fear in her eyes spoke volumes to anyone who cared to look. But she had nowhere else to go. The year was 1876, and the Dakota Territory was as unforgiving as it was vast. Grace had been walking since dawn, following the railroad tracks until they led her to this collection of wooden buildings straddling the edge of civilization. Her pale face was streaked with dirt, her auburn hair escaping from beneath a simple bonnet. In her arms, little Emma slept fitfully, bundled in the only clean blanket Grace had managed to salvage. As she stepped onto the town's main street, the curious stares of the townspeople followed her. She knew what they saw: a disheveled young woman of 21, clearly on the run, with no husband in sight and a baby in her arms. In a place like this, that alone was enough to mark her. "Madam, you look like you could use some help," came a deep voice from her right. Grace startled, clutching Emma closer as she turned to face the speaker. He sat atop a chestnut stallion, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the darkening sky. His face was partially obscured by the wide brim of his hat, but she could see the concern in his eyes and the star pinned to his weathered leather vest. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, her voice barely audible. "Name's Yates Keller," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion. He was tall, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of the prairie sky. A few days' worth of stubble lined his jaw, and despite his imposing figure, there was a gentleness to his movements as he approached. "And you look like you've come a long way." Grace took an instinctive step back. "I'm just passing through." The sheriff's eyes flicked to the sleeping infant, then back to Grace's face. Something in his expression softened. "Nobody just passes through Cottonwood Springs, madam. We're not exactly on the way to anywhere." Thunder cracked again, closer this time, and Emma stirred against Grace's chest with a whimper. The first fat droplets of rain began to fall, splattering the dust at their feet. "You've got nowhere to go, do you?" Sheriff Keller asked quietly. Grace's silence was answer enough. "Come on," he said, gesturing toward a building down the street. "At least get out of this rain. Mrs. Peterson runs the boarding house. She'll have a hot meal and a room for you and your little one." Grace hesitated. Trust wasn't something that came easily to her anymore. But as the rain began to fall in earnest and Emma started to cry, she knew she had few options. "I haven't much money," she admitted. Sheriff Keller studied her face for a long moment. "You've got courage enough, walking into a strange town with a baby and fear written all over your face. That counts for something around here." The simple acknowledgement of her bravery, something Grace hadn't felt in months, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. She blinked them back quickly and gave a small nod. "Thank you, Sheriff." As they walked toward the boarding house, Grace kept a careful distance between them. The sheriff seemed to understand, making no move to take her arm or guide her. Instead, he kept his hands visible, his pace measured. "How old?" he asked, nodding toward Emma. 3 months, Grace answered, relaxing slightly at the ordinary question. "Her name is Emma." "Pretty name," he said. "My mother's name was Emma." The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure with a wide front porch. Sheriff Keller opened the door, ushering Grace into a warm front parlor that smelled of baking bread and coffee. "Martha," he called, "got someone here who needs a room." A plump woman with gray-streaked hair appeared from the back, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. Her eyebrows rose at the sight of Grace and the baby, but she quickly masked her surprise. "Well, land sakes," she said. You poor thing, you're soaked through. Yates, fetch some towels from the cupboard while I put some coffee on. Mrs. Peterson bustled about, and within minutes Grace found herself seated at a kitchen table with a cup of hot coffee. Emma sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a dresser drawer padded with blankets. Now then, Mrs. Peterson said, setting a plate of freshly baked corn bread before Grace. I've got a room at the top of the stairs. It's not fancy, but it's clean and dry. I can't pay much, Grace began, but Mrs. Peterson waved her off. We'll sort that out later. For now, you eat. Sheriff Keller stood by the door, hat in hand. I should get back to my rounds. Storm's going to bring out all sorts of trouble. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at Grace. Miss Simmons, she supplied after a moment's hesitation. Grace Simmons. Miss Simmons, he nodded. Whatever you're running from, you're safe here for now. Grace's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. How do you know I'm running? A sad smile touched the sheriff's lips. Because nobody walks into Cottonwood Springs unless they're running from something or someone. With that, he settled his hat back on his head and disappeared into the rain. Mrs. Peterson waited until the door closed before turning to Grace. He's right, you know. Most folks around here have a past they'd rather not talk about. Nobody's going to pry into yours. Grace felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. Thank you. Finish your supper, dear. Then you and little Emma can get some rest. Things always look better in the morning. Grace doubted that, but she ate gratefully, realizing only then how hungry she'd been. Mrs. Peterson moved about the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dough for the next day's baking. How long has Yates the sheriff been here? Grace found herself asking. Oh, about 5 years now, Mrs. Peterson replied. Came from somewhere back east, St. Louis, I think. Doesn't talk much about it. She paused her kneading. He's a good man, fair. Keeps the peace without much fuss. Grace nodded, filing away the information. In her experience, there were few genuinely good men in the world. Her late husband had certainly not been one of them. After supper, Mrs. Peterson showed Grace to a small but clean room at the top of the stairs. A narrow bed with a patchwork quilt stood against one wall, a washstand with a pitcher and basin against another. A rocking chair sat near the single window that overlooked the main street. I'll bring up some clean linens for the little one, Mrs. Peterson said. And perhaps tomorrow we can find you some fresh clothes. When Grace was finally alone, she laid Emma in the middle of the bed and sat beside her, watching her daughter's peaceful sleep. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel something beyond fear, the faintest glimmer of hope. But as she stared out at the rain-slicked street below, she knew their respite would be temporary. Thomas would not stop looking for them. And when he found them as men like him, always did, she would need more than courage. She would need a miracle. Morning broke over Cottonwood Springs with the promise of a clear day after the storm. Grace woke to Emma's hungry cries and the unfamiliar sounds of a town coming to life, the clatter of wagon wheels, voices calling greetings, the distant whistle of a train. After feeding Emma and washing with the cold water from the pitcher, Grace ventured downstairs to find Mrs. Peterson already bustling about the kitchen, serving breakfast to 3 men in work clothes who barely glanced up as Grace entered. Good morning, dear, Mrs. Peterson greeted cheerfully. Sit down and have some breakfast. How did you sleep? Better than I have in weeks, Grace admitted, settling at the far end of the table with Emma cradled in one arm. Mrs. Peterson set a plate of eggs and biscuits before her, then held out her arms. Let me hold that little angel while you eat properly. Grace hesitated, her protective instinct flaring. I raised 5 of my own, Mrs. Peterson said gently. I promise she'll come to no harm. Slowly, Grace relinquished her daughter, watching carefully as Mrs. Peterson cooed and bounced the infant with practiced ease. "She's a beauty," the older woman commented. "Got your eyes?" Grace managed a small smile. "Yes, thank goodness." She ate quickly, aware of the curious glances from the other boarders despite their pretense of disinterest. When she finished, she thanked Mrs. Peterson and reclaimed Emma. "I should look for work," she said. "Is there anywhere in town that might need help?" Mrs. Peterson considered this. "Well, the general store might need a hand, or perhaps the dressmaker, though Miss Abigail can be particular. The saloon's always hiring girls, but that's no place for a woman with a child." "I can sew," Grace offered, "and I kept the books for my father's farm before." She trailed off, unwilling to delve into her past. "Start with the general store," Mrs. Peterson suggested. Mr. Hoffman's fair-minded, and his wife just had their fourth child, so they're short-handed. Armed with directions, Grace wrapped Emma in a clean blanket and stepped out onto the porch. In the daylight, Cottonwood Springs revealed itself to be a modest but orderly frontier town. The main street was lined with false-fronted buildings: the general store, a saloon, a small bank, the sheriff's office, and various other businesses necessary for frontier life. A white clapboard church stood at the far end of town, its spire reaching toward the vast blue sky. As Grace made her way toward the general store, she felt the weight of curious stares. A young woman with a baby and no husband was an object of speculation in a place like this. She kept her head high, though her heart raced with anxiety. The bell above the door jangled as she entered Hoffman's general store. The scents of coffee, leather, and dried goods filled the air. A balding man with spectacles looked up from behind the counter. "Good morning," he greeted. "What can I help you with today?" "Actually," Grace began, "I was hoping you might need some help. Mrs. Peterson at the boarding house suggested I inquire." Mr. Hoffman studied her for a moment, his eyes briefly moving to Emma. "You're new in town?" "Yes, sir. I arrived yesterday, and the baby's father." Grace's chin lifted slightly. "I'm a widow, Mr. Hoffman." It wasn't entirely untrue. Her husband was dead. She had watched him die. What she omitted was that Thomas had not been Emma's father. Mr. Hoffman's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mrs. Simmons. Grace Simmons." "Well, Mrs. Simmons, as it happens, my wife has been after me to hire some help. With the new baby at home, she can't mind the store as she used to." He gestured around the well-stocked establishment. "Can you keep accounts, read and write?" "Yes, sir. I kept all the books for my father's farm in Minnesota." "And the child, she won't be a distraction." Grace glanced down at Emma's peaceful face. "She's a good baby, sir, and I can work while she naps." Mr. Hoffman considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, we'll try it for a week. 6 days, sunup to sundown, with Sundays free. I can pay $3 a week. There's a small room in the back where you can put the baby down when needed." It wasn't much, but it would cover the boarding house and perhaps allow her to save a little. Grace nodded gratefully. "When would you like me to start?" "No time like the present," Mr. Hoffman said, moving around the counter. "I'll show you the ledgers." For the next several hours, Grace familiarized herself with the store's inventory and bookkeeping system. Emma slept contentedly in a wooden crate lined with clean burlap sacks, waking only when hungry. The work was straightforward, and Mr. Hoffman seemed pleased with her quick understanding. Around midday, the bell above the door jangled and Sheriff Keller stepped into the store. He paused momentarily when he spotted Grace behind the counter, surprise evident in his expression before he composed himself. "Miss Simmons," he greeted with a tip of his hat. "I see you've found employment." "Sheriff," she acknowledged with a nod. "Mr. Hoffman was kind enough to give me a position." "Glad to hear it." He turned to the storekeeper. "Henry, I need some coffee and ammunition, and whatever letters came in on yesterday's stage." As Mr. Hoffman gathered the sheriff's supplies, Yates Keller leaned against the counter, his blue eyes studying Grace with quiet intensity. "Settling in all right?" he asked. "Yes, thank you," she replied, keeping her tone polite but reserved. "How's the little one?" Despite her wariness, Grace couldn't help the small smile that touched her lips. "She's well, sleeping in the back room." The sheriff nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Good. That's good." He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything, my office is just down the street. Doors always open." Grace met his gaze, trying to discern his motives. In her experience, men rarely offered help without expecting something in return, but there was nothing in Sheriff Keller's eyes except genuine concern. "Thank you," she said finally, "but I'm sure we'll be fine." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I don't doubt it. Like I said yesterday, you've got courage enough." Mr. Hoffman returned with the sheriff's purchases, and Yates Keller paid and took his leave. As the door closed behind him, the storekeeper gave Grace a curious glance. "Sheriff seems to know you," he commented. "He was kind enough to direct me to the boarding house when I arrived," Grace explained, keeping her voice neutral. Mr. Hoffman nodded, seeming satisfied with the explanation. "Yates Keller's a good lawman. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair to everyone. Town was lucky to get him after old Sheriff Dawson was killed in that bank robbery." Grace didn't respond, focusing instead on arranging a display of canned goods. She had no intention of getting to know anyone in Cottonwood Springs too well. As soon as she had enough money, she and Emma would move on, perhaps to California or Oregon, somewhere Thomas's connections couldn't reach. The rest of the day passed quickly, with a steady stream of customers curious about the new face behind the counter. Grace kept her responses polite but vague, deflecting personal questions with practiced ease. By closing time, she was exhausted but pleased with her first day's work. "You did well today," Mr. Hoffman said as he locked the cash box. "Come back tomorrow at 7. With Emma cradled in her arms, Grace made her way back to the boarding house as dusk settled over the town. The saloon was coming to life, piano music and raucous laughter spilling onto the street. She quickened her pace, keeping her eyes fixed ahead. As she passed the sheriff's office, the door opened and Yates Keller emerged. He fell into step beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. "Mind if I walk with you?" he asked. "Getting dark." "I'm perfectly capable of walking 2 blocks, Sheriff," Grace replied, though without real heat in her voice. "Never suggested otherwise," he said easily. "But a lady shouldn't have to walk alone past the saloon on a Saturday night." As if to prove his point, a drunk cowboy stumbled out of the saloon doors ahead, nearly colliding with them before Yates smoothly steered Grace out of the way with a light touch to her elbow. "Evening, Jenkins," the sheriff greeted the swaying man. "Think you've had enough for one night?" "Evenin', Sheriff," the man slurred, his bleary eyes focusing on Grace. "Who's the pretty lady? Miss Simmons is new in town," Yates replied, his tone pleasant but firm. "And she's headed home with her baby. Best let her pass." The drunk cowboy attempted a clumsy bow, nearly toppling over in the process. "Beggin' your pardon, madam." Grace nodded stiffly and continued walking, aware of the sheriff's solid presence beside her. Despite her determination to remain aloof, she found herself grateful for his escort. "Thank you," she said quietly as they reached the boarding house. Yates touched the brim of his hat. "My pleasure, Miss Simmons." He hesitated, then asked, "Will you be attending church services tomorrow? Reverend Thompson gives a decent sermon and it's a good way to meet folks." Grace shifted Emma to her other arm. "I don't think so. Emma keeps me busy and I should rest while I can. I start early at the store on Monday." If he was disappointed by her refusal, he didn't show it. "Of course. Another time, perhaps." He tipped his hat again. "Good night, Miss Simmons." "Good night, little Emma." As he walked away, Grace found herself watching his retreating figure longer than necessary. There was something about Sheriff Yates Keller that unsettled her, not in the way that made her fear for her safety, but in a way that made her wonder if perhaps her trust had been misplaced before. Shaking off the thought, she entered the boarding house, where Mrs. Peterson was setting the table for supper. "There you are, dear," the older woman greeted. "Just in time. And how was your first day at Hoffman's?" "It went well," Grace replied, settling into a chair. "Mr. Hoffman seems pleased." "Good, good. He's fair-minded, even if he's a bit tight with $1. Mrs. Peterson's eyes twinkled with good humor. "I saw the sheriff walking you home." Grace felt a flush creep into her cheeks. "He happened to be leaving his office as I passed by." Mrs. Peterson hummed noncommittally, but her knowing smile made Grace uneasy. The last thing she needed was the town thinking she had designs on the sheriff, or worse, that he had designs on her. "Mrs. Peterson," she began carefully, "I should make it clear that I'm not looking for entanglements of any kind. Emma and I will likely not stay in Cottonwood Springs permanently." The older woman's expression softened. "Child, nobody's expecting anything of you, but a friendly face and a helping hand now and then, those aren't entanglements. They're what make life bearable, especially out here." Grace had no answer for that. She ate her supper quietly, listening as the other boarders discussed local news and gossip. When Emma began to fuss, she excused herself and retreated to her room, grateful for the solitude. As she rocked her daughter to sleep, Grace gazed out at the star-filled sky. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might be safe here, at least for a while. The town was small but not unfriendly. She had work, shelter, and perhaps even the beginnings of protection if Sheriff Keller's interest was genuine. But safety was an illusion she couldn't afford to believe in. Thomas's brother was still out there, still searching. He had resources and connections that stretched far beyond what she could imagine. And he had made it clear that he considered Emma his family's property, a Blackwood by blood if not by name. Grace pressed a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead. "We'll be all right," she whispered. "I won't let anyone take you from me. I promise." With that vow renewed in her heart, she laid the sleeping infant in the makeshift cradle and prepared for bed, pushing away thoughts of kind blue eyes and the steady presence of a man who had called her courageous. The next 2 weeks settled into a rhythm that almost felt like normalcy. Grace worked diligently at the general store, gradually earning Mr. Hoffman's trust and approval. Emma became a favorite with the customers, many of whom brought small gifts: a hand-knitted cap, a tiny wooden rattle, a soft flannel blanket. Despite her initial reservations, Grace found herself warming to the simple kindness of the townspeople. Sheriff Keller made a point of stopping by the store most days, ostensibly to check for mail or purchase supplies. His visits were brief but regular, and though Grace maintained her polite distance, she couldn't deny a certain anticipation when the bell above the door announced his arrival. "Miss Simmons," he greeted her one particularly busy afternoon, tipping his hat as he approached the counter. "Sheriff," she returned with a nod, continuing to stack tins of peaches. "What can I help you with today?" "Just came to let you know there's a medicine show coming to town next week," he said, leaning against the counter. "They usually bring a photographer with them. Thought you might want to get a picture taken with Emma." Grace paused in her work, surprised by the thoughtfulness of the suggestion. "A photograph," Yates nodded. "Might be nice to have. Babies grow so fast." The idea appealed to her more than she wanted to admit. She had no pictures of Emma, nothing to preserve these precious early months, but photographs cost money she couldn't spare. "That's kind of you to mention," she said carefully, "but I should save my wages." Something flickered in Yates's eyes, understanding, perhaps, or determination. "Well, if you change your mind, they'll be setting up by the church on Tuesday." Before she could respond, the store door opened again, admitting Mrs. Hoffman with her infant son bundled in her arms and 3 older children trailing behind her. She was a petite woman with a perpetually harried expression that brightened when she spotted the sheriff. "Yates Keller, just the man I wanted to see," she declared. "Henry told me you caught those boys who were stealing chickens from the Thompson farm." Yates straightened, touching his hat respectfully. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hoffman." "Yes, madam. Just some youngsters looking for mischief. Mr. Thompson decided not to press charges after they agreed to help with the harvest." "Well, that's for the best," Mrs. Hoffman approved. She turned her attention to Grace. "And you must be Miss Simmons. Henry speaks highly of your work." Grace felt her cheeks warm at the unexpected praise. "Thank you, madam. Mr. Hoffman has been very kind." "Nonsense. Henry's never kind unless someone deserves it," Mrs. Hoffman said with a laugh. She peered at Emma, who was awake in her makeshift crib behind the counter. "Oh, what a darling! May I?" Before Grace could respond, Mrs. Hoffman had handed her own baby to the sheriff, who accepted the bundle with surprising ease and was leaning over to admire Emma. "She's beautiful, Mrs. Hoffman declared. "How old?" "Almost 4 months now," Grace answered, watching nervously as the woman cooed over her daughter. "Well, she's a credit to you." Mrs. Hoffman straightened and reclaimed her son from the sheriff, who looked almost reluctant to give up the infant. "I've come to drag Henry home for dinner. Children, stay by the candy jars while I fetch your father." As she disappeared into the back office, her children obediently lined up by the glass jars of penny candy, their eyes wide with anticipation. Yates chuckled at their expressions. "Hoffman's going to be out a few cents worth of horehound drops," he predicted. Grace smiled despite herself. He already set aside their weekly allowance. Their eyes met for a moment, and something warm flickered between them, a simple shared amusement that felt dangerously like connection. Grace looked away first, busying herself with rearranging a display of buttons. "Well," Yates said after a moment, "I should get back to my rounds. Good day, Miss Simmons." "Good day, Sheriff," she replied, not looking up until the bell signaled his departure. Mrs. Hoffman emerged from the back with her husband in tow. The children were given their promised candy, and the family took their leave after extracting Mr. Hoffman's promise to close the store early. "Take the rest of the afternoon, Mrs. Simmons," Mr. Hoffman told Grace as he collected his hat. "It's been a slow day anyway." Grateful for the unexpected free time, Grace gathered Emma and her few belongings and stepped out into the late afternoon sunshine. Instead of turning toward the boarding house, she found herself walking toward the edge of town, where a small creek meandered through a stand of cottonwood trees that had given the settlement its name. Finding a grassy spot in the dappled shade, she spread her shawl on the ground and sat with Emma beside her. The baby kicked her legs happily in the fresh air, tiny fingers reaching for the leaves that drifted down from the trees above. "You like it here, don't you?" Grace murmured, tickling Emma's round belly. The open sky and all this space. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to consider what it might be like to stay. To build a life in this small frontier town, where Emma could grow up knowing the freedom of open spaces and the security of a community. Where perhaps, in time, Grace might even find. She cut the thought off before it could fully form. There was no sense in dreaming of things that could never be. Thomas's brother would never stop looking for them. And even if by some miracle he didn't find them, Grace wasn't sure she could ever trust a man again, not after what she had endured. A twig snapped behind her, and Grace whirled, her heart racing with sudden fear. Sheriff Keller stood a few yards away, his expression apologetic. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, remaining where he was. "I was checking the creek crossing when I saw you and the little one." Grace's pulse gradually slowed, though her nerves remained on edge. "We're just enjoying the fresh air." Yates nodded, glancing up at the golden leaves overhead. "It's a nice spot, peaceful." He hesitated, then added, "I can leave you be if you'd prefer." Something in his respectful deference, the way he always seemed to understand her need for space, made Grace relent slightly. "You can sit if you like," she offered, gesturing to the grass nearby. "Emma seems to enjoy company." A smile warmed his features as he settled at her respectable distance. "She's growing like a weed, must be all that fresh country air." "And Mrs. Peterson's cooking," Grace added with a small smile of her own. "She's constantly trying to fatten us both up." "Martha Peterson could fatten up a fence post," Yates agreed with a chuckle. "Best biscuits in the territory." They lapsed into a companionable silence, watching as Emma batted at a leaf drifting on the gentle breeze. "She has your eyes," Yates observed after a while. "Same color as the sky just before sunset." Grace felt a flush creep into her cheeks at the unexpected poetry in his words. "Thank you." Though the rest of her is all her father. The moment the words left her mouth, she regretted them. She rarely spoke of Emma's father, preferring to maintain the fiction of widowhood without elaboration. "Your husband," Yates said carefully. "How long has he been gone?" Grace hesitated, wondering how much to reveal. "He died before Emma was born." It wasn't entirely a lie. The man who had fathered Emma, a kind young ranch hand named Jonathan, had indeed died before her birth. But he had never been Grace's husband. That title had belonged to Thomas Blackwood, a man 20 years her senior who had married her after her father's death left her destitute, only to treat her as property rather than a wife. "I'm sorry," Yates said simply, his blue eyes filled with genuine sympathy. Grace nodded, looking away. "It was difficult, but we manage. More than manage, I'd say," he replied. "You've made quite an impression on Hoffman. He's not easy to please." Grateful for the change of subject, Grace allowed herself a small smile. "He's a fair employer, and the work suits me." "You planning to stay in Cottonwood Springs, then?" Yates asked, his tone casual though his eyes were intent. The question hung between them, weighted with implications Grace wasn't ready to confront. She busied herself with adjusting Emma's blanket. "I haven't decided," she answered finally. "It depends on many things." Yates seemed to accept this non-answer. He leaned back on his elbows, his long legs stretched out before him, the picture of relaxed ease. But Grace wasn't fooled. She'd noticed how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, how his hand never strayed far from the gun at his hip. Sheriff Keller was a man who remained vigilant even in repose. "Whatever you decide," he said after a moment, "Cottonwood Springs could use more folks like you, hard-working, honest." His gaze met hers, brave. There it was again, that assessment of courage that always unsettled her. "You keep saying that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know me, Sheriff. I know enough," he replied simply. "I've seen my share of people in trouble, Miss Simmons, seen how they handle it. Some break, some run, some stand their ground." He nodded toward Emma. "And some walk into a strange town with nothing but a baby and determination." Grace swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. If only he knew how often she'd been tempted to give up, how many times fear had nearly paralyzed her. "I should get back," she said abruptly, gathering Emma into her arms. "Mrs. Peterson will be wondering where we are." Yates rose smoothly to his feet, offering a hand to help her up. After a moment's hesitation, Grace accepted it, trying to ignore the warmth that spread through her at the brief contact. "I'll walk with you," he said, and this time Grace didn't protest. As they made their way back toward town, Emma nestled contentedly against Grace's shoulder, the setting sun painting the prairie gold. Something had shifted between them during their brief conversation by the creek, a tentative trust beginning to form, as delicate and promising as the first green shoots after a long winter. For Grace, it was as terrifying as it was tempting. Trust was a luxury she had not allowed herself since the night she'd fled her husband's home, blood on her hands and terror in her heart. But as they walked in companionable silence, the tall figure of the sheriff steady beside her, she found herself wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, Cottonwood Springs might become more than a temporary haven. It was a dangerous thought, but in the golden light of the prairie sunset, even danger seemed distant and manageable. The medicine show arrived in Cottonwood Springs with all the fanfare a traveling entertainment could muster in the frontier lands. Colorful banners were strung between the buildings on Main Street, and the distinctive odors of exotic oils and tonics mingled with the usual scents of dust and horses. Grace watched from the window of the general store as wagons decorated with garish paintings of miraculous cures paraded past. The townsfolk had turned out in force, children running alongside the procession with excited shouts, adults trying to appear more restrained in their curiosity but clearly just as intrigued. "Quite a spectacle," Mr. Hoffman commented, coming to stand beside her. "Though between you and me, that miracle tonic is likely nothing more than whiskey and molasses with a dash of laudanum." Grace smiled at his cynicism. "I imagine the entertainment is worth the price of admission, even if the medicine isn't." "True enough," Mr. Hoffman agreed. "They've brought a proper photographer this time. I see. Daguerreotype studio in that black wagon there." Grace followed his pointing finger to a somber black wagon at the end of the procession, a stark contrast to the colorful vehicles preceding it. Her thoughts went immediately to Sheriff Keller's suggestion about having Emma's photograph taken. "Will you be closing the store for the show tonight?" she asked. Mr. Hoffman nodded. "Have to, or I'll never hear the end of it from the missus and the children. 7 o'clock sharp." "You should attend, Mrs. Simmons. Might do you and the little one some good to enjoy the festivities." The idea held more appeal than Grace cared to admit. The weeks of steady work and quiet evenings at the boarding house had begun to wear on her, despite the relative safety they provided. And Emma, now approaching 5 months, was becoming more aware of her surroundings, her eyes following movement with increasing interest. "Perhaps we will," she conceded. The afternoon passed in a flurry of customers, many stocking up on supplies before the evening's entertainment. By closing time, Grace was more than ready to return to the boarding house for a quick supper before the show. As she was gathering her things, the bell above the door jangled and Sheriff Keller stepped inside. He removed his hat as he approached the counter, revealing hair the color of sun-bleached wheat, slightly damp at the temples from the heat of the day. "Evening, Miss Simmons," he greeted. "Hoffman." Mr. Hoffman nodded in acknowledgement as he counted the day's receipts. "Sheriff." "Come to escort our Mrs. Simmons to the medicine show." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implication. "Mr. Hoffman, the sheriff surely has duties this evening, actually." Yates interrupted smoothly. "I was hoping you and Emma might allow me to accompany you. These traveling shows attract all sorts, and I'd feel better knowing you had an escort." The genuine concern in his eyes made it difficult for Grace to refuse, despite her instinctive wariness. "That's very kind," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to impose on your duties." A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Being seen at public gatherings is part of my duties, Miss Simmons. Keeps folks feeling safe." Mr. Hoffman made a poor attempt to hide his amusement as he busied himself with the cash box. "Well, that's settled then. You two run along. I'll lock up here." Finding herself maneuvered into acceptance, Grace gathered Emma, who was awake and alert in her basket behind the counter. "We need to stop at the boarding house first so I can feed her before the show." "Of course," Yates agreed, holding the door open for her. "I'll wait on the porch." True to his word, the sheriff waited patiently while Grace hurried through a light supper and tended to Emma's needs. When she emerged from the boarding house, she had changed into her one good dress, a modest blue cotton that had seen better days, but was still presentable, and had wrapped Emma in the new blanket gifted by one of the store's customers. Yates's appreciative glance as she descended the porch steps sent an unwelcome flutter through Grace's stomach. "You look lovely, Miss Simmons," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, adjusting Emma in her arms to hide her discomfort at the compliment. "Shall we go?" The town center had been transformed in the short time Grace had been at the boarding house. Torches illuminated a makeshift stage erected in front of the saloon, and rows of benches had been arranged for seating. Many townsfolk had already gathered, creating a festive atmosphere that reminded Grace of county fairs from her childhood. Yates led her to a bench near the back, where they would have a clear view but could easily depart if Emma became fussy. As they settled in, several people nodded greetings, their curious glances moving between Grace and the sheriff with poorly concealed interest. "Everyone staring," Grace murmured, discomfort prickling along her spine. Yates's shoulder brushed against hers as he leaned closer to reply. "Small town, not much excitement besides cattle prices and weather forecasts. A new face is bound to attract attention." "It's not just that," Grace said, keeping her voice low. "They're wondering about us." A smile touched his lips, but he didn't deny it. "Let them wonder, no harm in it." Before Grace could formulate a response, the show began with a flourish of music from a small band, a fiddle, a banjo, and a portly man with an impressive mustache playing a concertina. The self-proclaimed Professor Maximilian Marvel bounded onto the stage, resplendent in a red velvet coat and top hat. "Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of this fine community," he proclaimed in a booming voice. "Prepare to be amazed, astonished, and altogether astounded by the wonders of modern science and ancient wisdom combined in Marvel's miraculous medical marvels." The crowd applauded enthusiastically, and even Grace found herself smiling at the showman's flamboyant delivery. Emma, wide-eyed at the lights and sounds, remained contentedly in Grace's lap, occasionally reaching toward the colorful spectacle. For the next hour, Professor Marvel presented a series of increasingly outlandish demonstrations, a strong man lifting impossible weights after supposedly taking the tonic, a formerly deaf woman who could suddenly hear after a few drops of auditory restoration elixir, and culminating in the professor himself supposedly swallowing fire after coating his throat with thermal protection solution. During a brief intermission, Yates leaned toward Grace, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Quite a performance, though I notice he's careful not to let anyone examine those miracle cures too closely." Grace laughed softly, surprising herself with how natural it felt. "The deaf woman is traveling with the show. I saw her directing the musicians before the performance began." "Sharp eyes, Miss Simmons," Yates approved, "would make a fine deputy." Their eyes met in shared humor, and for a moment Grace forgot to be guarded. She simply enjoyed the warmth of human connection, the simple pleasure of shared entertainment on a mild autumn evening. As the second half of the show began, Emma began to grow restless, small sounds of discontent indicating her patience was wearing thin. "Perhaps we should leave before she decides to compete with Professor Marvel for volume," Grace whispered, rising from her seat. Yates stood immediately. "Of course, But before we go, would you still like to visit the photographer? Grace hesitated. The expense seemed frivolous, yet the idea of having a memento of Emma at this age and perhaps of this brief period of peace was powerfully tempting. I don't know if I can consider it a gift, Yates said quickly. For Emma, something she'll treasure when she's grown. Grace's instinct was to refuse, to maintain the independence she had fought so hard to establish. But the sincerity in Yates's expression stopped her. This wasn't charity offered from pity, but a genuine gift from someone who had come to care for them both. Thank you, she said finally. That would be lovely. The photographer had set up his equipment in the black wagon, which opened to reveal a small but efficient studio. A painted backdrop depicting a garden scene stood at one end, with a velvet-covered chair positioned before it. Various props were arranged neatly on a small table: fans, books, artificial flowers. The photographer himself was a thin, serious man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He greeted them with a distracted nod, his attention focused on preparing his equipment. A portrait of mother and child. He asked, not looking up from his work. Yes, Yates confirmed. How long will it take? 15 minutes for the sitting, 3 days to develop. I can have it ready before we depart on Friday. Grace sat in the indicated chair, arranging Emma on her lap. The baby, intrigued by the strange surroundings, had ceased her fussing and was now staring wide-eyed at the photographer's silver equipment. The child will need to remain still, the photographer warned, ducking beneath the black cloth behind his camera. And you must hold your pose without movement. She'll manage, Grace said confidently, settling Emma more securely against her. One moment, Yates said, stepping forward. He removed a small silver object from his pocket, a delicate rattle that caught the lamplight. This might help keep her attention. He handed it to Grace, who shook it gently before Emma's fascinated eyes. The soft tinkling sound captivated the infant, who reached for the shiny object with eager hands. Perfect, the photographer declared. Now, remain absolutely still. For the next few minutes, Grace held her position, the rattle poised before Emma, who gazed at it in rapt attention. She was acutely aware of Yates watching from the side, his expression a mixture of admiration and something deeper that she dared not name. Excellent, the photographer announced finally. A successful exposure. You may move now. Grace released her breath, flexing her stiff shoulders as Emma immediately grabbed for the rattle, which Grace relinquished to her tiny hands. It's beautiful, she said to Yates, examining the silver toy more closely. Delicately engraved flowers decorated its surface, and it had a pleasing weight that suggested solid craftsmanship. Where did you find it? A shadow passed briefly over his face. It was my sister's. One of the few things I kept after she passed. The personal revelation, the first he had shared about his past, caught Grace off guard. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. Yates shook his head, his expression clearing. It's all right, it was a long time ago. I think she'd be pleased to know it's bringing joy to another little girl. As they stepped out of the photographer's wagon, the night air cool on their faces, Grace found herself studying Yates's profile in the torchlight. He was a man of contradictions, strong yet gentle, vigilant yet relaxed, private yet forthcoming when it mattered. Every interaction revealed new facets that challenged her determination to keep her distance. Thank you, she said quietly as they walked back toward the boarding house, the sounds of the medicine show fading behind them. For the photograph and for the evening. Yates smiled down at her, his eyes reflecting the torch flames as they passed. My pleasure, Miss Simmons, truly. When they reached the boarding house, Grace paused at the bottom of the porch steps, Emma now sleeping peacefully in her arms. Would you like to come in for coffee? She offered, surprising herself with the invitation. Something flickered in Yates's eyes, pleasure quickly tempered by restraint. "I'd like that very much," he said, "but perhaps another time. I should finish my rounds before turning in." Grace nodded, a mixture of relief and disappointment washing through her. "Of course. Good night, Sheriff." "Yates," he corrected gently. "After sharing an evening and a photograph, I think you might call me Yates." A small smile touched her lips. "Good night, Yates." "Good night, Grace," he returned, the sound of her name on his lips sending an unexpected warmth through her. As she climbed the steps, she glanced back to find him still watching, hat in hand, a respectful guardian ensuring her safe return. Something shifted in her heart at the sight of a crack in the wall she had built around herself and Emma. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. And as she entered the boarding house, Grace wondered if perhaps the most courageous thing she had done was not walking into town with a baby and fear, but allowing herself to begin to trust again. 3 days later, Yates arrived at the general store just before closing, a flat package wrapped in brown paper tucked under his arm. Grace looked up from the ledger she was balancing, her heart quickening at the sight of him. "Is that?" she asked, nodding toward the package. Yates nodded, setting it carefully on the counter. "Just picked it up from the photographer. Would you like to see it?" Grace wiped her ink-stained fingers on her apron and reached for the package with eager hands. She unwrapped it carefully to reveal the daguerreotype in its simple wooden frame. The image captured Grace seated with perfect posture, Emma on her lap, both looking at the silver rattle held just out of frame. What struck Grace most was not the technical quality of the photograph, though it was excellent, but the expression on her own face as she gazed at her daughter. There was love there, certainly, but also a quiet strength she hadn't recognized in herself. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tracing a finger over the cool glass. "Yes, it is," Yates agreed, though his eyes were on Grace rather than the photograph. She felt his gaze and looked up, a flush warming her cheeks at the open admiration in his expression. For a moment, they stood in silence, something unspoken passing between them. The spell was broken by Mr. Hoffman clearing his throat pointedly as he emerged from the storeroom. "Closing time, Mrs. Simmons. Unless the sheriff has official business." "No, Henry, just delivering a package," Yates replied easily, though his eyes remained on Grace. "But I would be obliged if you'd allow me to escort Mrs. Simmons back to the boarding house." Mr. Hoffman's eyebrows rose slightly, but he merely nodded. "Of course. See you tomorrow, Mrs. Simmons." Grace carefully rewrapped the photograph and gathered her things, including Emma, who was awake and alert in her basket. Outside, the October evening was cool, the first hint of winter in the air as they walked toward the boarding house. "Thank you again," Grace said, holding the package close. "It's a gift I'll treasure." "I'm glad," Yates replied. After a moment, he added, "Grace, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." The serious tone of his voice sent a flutter of anxiety through her. "Yes. The harvest dance is next Saturday. It's a tradition here in Cottonwood Springs. The whole town comes together before winter sets in." He hesitated, then continued, "I was wondering if you might consider attending. With me." Grace's steps slowed as she absorbed the invitation. A public event with Yates as her escort, it would be a clear statement to the town, an acknowledgement of whatever was growing between them. "I don't know," she began hesitantly. "Emma, Mrs. Peterson already offered to watch her," Yates said, a hint of sheepishness in his smile. "She might have encouraged me to ask you." Grace couldn't help but laugh at that. "Mrs. Peterson has been dropping hints about you for weeks." "I should have known she'd take matters into her own hands eventually." Yates's smile widened at her laughter. "She's a determined woman, but the choice is yours, Grace. No pressure." They had reached the boarding house steps, and Grace turned to face him, the photograph clutched to her chest like a shield. Part of her wanted desperately to experience a normal evening, to dance and laugh like the young woman she was, rather than the fugitive she had become. But another part, the cautious guardian of her and Emma's safety, whispered warnings. "May I think about it?" she asked finally. "Of course," Yates replied, no disappointment evident in his voice or expression. "Take all the time you need." As Grace climbed the steps, she paused at the top, looking back at him. "Yates? Yes, thank you for understanding." He tipped his hat, a gesture that had become familiar and oddly comforting. "Always, Grace." That night, after Emma was asleep in her cradle, Grace sat by the window with the photograph in her lap, tracing the outlines of their faces in the silver image. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to truly contemplate a future, not just survival, but a life rebuilt from the ashes of what Thomas had destroyed. Could she trust again? Could she risk not just her heart, but Emma's safety? Yates Keller was unlike any man she had known, patient, respectful, steady. But her judgment had failed her once before, with catastrophic consequences. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Rising quietly so as not to disturb Emma, Grace opened it to find Mrs. Peterson holding a steaming cup of tea. "Thought you might like this before bed," the older woman said, offering the cup. "Helps with sleep." Grace accepted it gratefully. "Thank you." Mrs. Peterson hesitated, then asked, "Mind if I join you for a moment, unless you're tired?" "Not at all," Grace replied, gesturing to the small table by the window. "Please." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, sipping their tea and listening to Emma's soft breathing from the cradle. "He asked you to the dance," Mrs. Peterson stated finally. "Not a question." Grace nodded. "He mentioned you had offered to watch Emma." "That I did." Mrs. Peterson's eyes, kind but shrewd, studied Grace's face. "He's a good man, Yates Keller, one of the best I've known." "I believe that," Grace admitted softly, "but it's complicated." The older woman nodded, understanding in her expression. "Life usually is, dear, especially for young women on their own." She paused, then added carefully, "Whatever you're running from or whoever, it doesn't change who you are. A good mother. A hardworking woman, someone deserving of happiness." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "You don't know what I've done." "I know enough," Mrs. Peterson replied, echoing Yates's words from weeks before. "I know a good soul when I see one, and I know fear when I see it too." She reached across the table to pat Grace's hand. "But fear's a poor compass for life's journey, dear. Trust me on that." With that, she rose, collecting Grace's empty cup. "Sleep on it, and remember it's just a dance, not a lifetime commitment." After Mrs. Peterson left, Grace returned to the window, gazing out at the star-strewn sky. Just a dance. A few hours of normalcy in a life that had been anything but normal for so long. Perhaps Mrs. Peterson was right. Perhaps it was time to let courage guide her rather than fear, the courage Yates had recognized in her from the beginning, even when she couldn't see it in herself. Decision made, Grace finally lay down to sleep, and for the first time in months, her dreams were not haunted by the past. The following Saturday evening found Grace standing before the small mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back at her. Mrs. Peterson and several other women from town had rallied to ensure she had a proper dress for the occasion, a simple but elegant creation of deep blue muslin with lace trim at the collar and cuffs. Her auburn hair, usually confined in a practical bun, had been arranged by Mrs. Peterson's skilled hands into a cascade of soft curls pinned up at the sides with mother-of-pearl combs borrowed from the dressmaker. "You look beautiful, dear," Mrs. Peterson declared from the doorway, where she stood with Emma in her arms. "Absolutely lovely." Grace smoothed the unfamiliar fabric nervously. It feels strange. I haven't dressed like this since. She trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. Since before the hard times, Mrs. Peterson supplied tactfully. Well, it's high time you remembered you're a young woman, not just a mother and a worker. A knock at the front door downstairs sent a flutter of anticipation through Grace's stomach. He's here. Then you'd best not keep him waiting, Mrs. Peterson said with a smile. Emma and I will be fine. We have big plans for a rocking chair and some lullabies. Grace pressed a kiss to Emma's forehead, inhaling her sweet baby scent for courage. Be good for Mrs. Peterson, my love. With a final glance in the mirror, Grace descended the stairs, her heart thundering in her chest. Yates stood in the front parlor, hat in hand, dressed in what was clearly his finest, a crisp white shirt, dark vest, and clean black trousers. His usually wind-tousled hair was neatly combed, and he had trimmed his beard to perfection. When he turned and saw her on the stairs, the admiration that bloomed in his eyes made Grace's breath catch. For a moment neither spoke, each taking in the transformed appearance of the other. You look. Yates began, then shook his head slightly as if words failed him. Beautiful doesn't seem adequate. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. Thank you, you look very handsome yourself. He offered his arm with a slight bow. Shall we? The dance was being held in the town's largest building, the newly constructed grain warehouse, which had been transformed with paper lanterns, autumn leaves, and ribbons into a surprisingly festive venue. A small band played on a raised platform at one end, and tables laden with food and drink lined the walls. Nearly everyone in Cottonwood Springs and the surrounding area seemed to be in attendance, the women in their best dresses, the men in clean shirts and polished boots. As Grace and Yates entered, a momentary hush fell over the nearest group of townsfolk, followed by a flurry of whispers and smiles. Grace tightened her grip on Yates's arm, suddenly self-conscious. Everyone's staring, she murmured. Because you're the most beautiful woman in the room, Yates replied simply. Before Grace could respond to this declaration, Mr. Hoffman approached with his wife, both beaming with approval. Mrs. Simmons, Sheriff. So glad you could join us, Mr. Hoffman greeted, while his wife immediately embraced Grace. You look wonderful, my dear, Mrs. Hoffman declared. That color is perfect with your complexion. More greetings followed as various townsfolk approached to welcome them. Grace was touched by the genuine warmth of their reception. These people who had been strangers just weeks ago now welcomed her as one of their own. Even the local ladies who had initially regarded her with suspicion seemed to have accepted her presence, especially now that she arrived on the arm of their respected sheriff. As the band struck up a lively tune, Yates turned to Grace with a question in his eyes. Would you care to dance? Grace hesitated. It's been a very long time. I'll lead, he assured her with a smile. Trust me. There was that word again, trust. As Grace placed her hand in his and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor, she realized that she did trust him, at least in this moment. Trust him to guide her through the dance, to keep her safe in this crowded room, to treat her with the respect he had shown from the beginning. Yates's hand settled at her waist, warm and steady, as he led her into a spirited reel. He was a surprisingly graceful dancer for such a tall man, and Grace found herself relaxing into the music and movement, her earlier nervousness fading as they circled the floor together. Where did you learn to dance so well? She asked as they paused between sets. A shadow crossed his face briefly. My mother insisted on proper lessons for both my sister and me, said even in the West, a gentleman should know how to conduct himself in polite society. It was another small revelation about his past, offered freely in the spirit of the evening. Grace found herself hungry for more to understand the man whose steady presence had become so important to her. "You don't speak of your family often," she observed carefully. Yates's expression grew thoughtful. "No, I suppose I don't." He guided her toward the refreshment table where he obtained 2 cups of punch. "Not much to tell, really. Father was a banker in St. Louis. Mother came from old Southern money. They had expectations for me that didn't align with my own ambitions." "So you came west," Grace supplied. He nodded, taking a sip of punch. After the war, nothing back east made sense anymore, needed open skies and honest work. His eyes met hers. "What about you before?" "Everything. Where was home?" The question was gentle, without pressure, but Grace still felt her defenses rise. She had shared so little of her past with anyone in Cottonwood Springs. "Minnesota," she said after a moment. "A small farm near Rochester. My father grew wheat and raised a few cattle. My mother died when I was 12, so it was just the 2 of us until—" She trailed off, unwilling to delve into the darker chapters of her story. Understanding her reluctance, Yates didn't press. "It's beautiful country, Minnesota. All those lakes." Grateful for his sensitivity, Grace smiled. "Yes, it is, though there's something to be said for the prairies too. The openness, the freedom." "Is that what you want, Grace?" he asked softly. "Freedom." The directness of the question caught her off guard. She stared into her punch cup, gathering her thoughts. "I want safety," she admitted finally. "For Emma. And yes, freedom from fear, from always looking over my shoulder." Something shifted in Yates's expression, a determination, a promise. "I'd like to help with that if you'd let me." The band struck up a waltz, saving Grace from having to respond immediately to the loaded statement. Yates set aside their cups and offered his hand. "One more dance." She placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her back to the floor. This time, as he drew her into the waltz, the space between them seemed smaller, more intimate. His hand at her waist was gentle but firm, guiding her through the turns with confidence. "You never answered my question," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Grace looked up into his eyes, finding patience and something deeper waiting there. "I don't know how," she admitted honestly. "I've learned to rely only on myself." "I understand," he said, and somehow she believed that he truly did. "But sometimes, Grace, the bravest thing isn't facing the world alone. Sometimes it's letting someone stand beside you." The waltz ended, and they stood still among the moving couples, connected by joined hands and unspoken possibilities. In his blue eyes, Grace saw a future she had stopped allowing herself to imagine, one with security, companionship, perhaps even love. It terrified her. It tempted her. It made her want things she had convinced herself were beyond her reach. "I need some air," she said suddenly, needing space to think. Yates nodded immediately, releasing her except for a light touch at her elbow as he guided her toward the side door that opened onto a small veranda. The October night was cool but not cold, the stars brilliant in the clear sky above. Grace moved to the railing, drawing deep breaths of the fresh air, aware of Yates standing a respectful distance behind her, giving her the space she needed while remaining protectively close. "I'm sorry if I spoke out of turn," he said quietly. "The last thing I want is to make you uncomfortable." She turned to face him, her heart pounding with emotions she had kept tightly contained for so long. "It's not that, it's just complicated." Yates moved closer, his expression earnest in the dim light spilling from the warehouse windows. "I know you have secrets, Grace. I haven't asked about them because I figured you'd tell me when you were ready, if you were ready." He paused, then continued more softly, "But I need you to know something. Whatever you're running from, whoever you're afraid of, you don't have to face it alone anymore. Not if you don't want to." The simple declaration, free of demands or conditions, broke something loose inside Grace. The tears she had held back for so long spilled over, tracing silver paths down her cheeks. "You don't know what you're offering," she whispered. "What I've done. What might come looking for us." Yates stepped closer, gently raising a hand to brush away her tears. "Then tell me. Let me help carry the burden." Perhaps it was the music drifting through the open door, or the stars overhead, or simply the absolute certainty in Yates's eyes. Whatever the reason, Grace found herself doing something she had sworn never to do, sharing the truth she had guarded so carefully. "My husband's name was Thomas Blackwood," she began, her voice barely audible. "He was a wealthy man, much older than me. After my father died, leaving nothing but debts, Thomas offered marriage. I had no choice." Yates listened silently, his eyes never leaving her face as she continued. "He was cruel, not just to me but to everyone, especially the ranch hands." Her hands tightened on the railing behind her. "There was one young man, Jonathan. He was kind to me when Thomas was away on business, which was often. We became close." Understanding dawned in Yates's eyes. "Emma's father." Grace nodded, relief washing through her at not having to spell it out. "Thomas discovered us. He was enraged. She faltered, the memories still raw. "He killed Jonathan, said he was a thief, shot him in the back, and then he turned on me." Her hand unconsciously moved to her side, where the scar from Thomas's knife remained, a permanent reminder of that night. "He would have killed me too if I hadn't fought back," she continued, her voice steadier now. "I pushed him and he fell, hit his head on the hearth." She met Yates's gaze directly. "I didn't mean to kill him, but I wasn't sorry that he was dead." "Self-defense," Yates said firmly. "No court would convict you." "His brother didn't see it that way," Grace replied. "Edward Blackwood is even more powerful than Thomas was. He swore he'd find me, that he'd take Emma, his brother's property, by blood," he said, as if she were a horse or cattle. Bitterness crept into her voice. "I ran that night and haven't stopped since, until Cottonwood Springs." The silence that followed her confession was heavy with unspoken implications. Grace waited for judgment, for withdrawal, for the change in Yates's eyes that would signal the end of whatever had been growing between them. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression a mixture of anger at what she had endured and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. "Thank you for trusting me with the truth," he said simply. "It doesn't change anything, Grace, except now I understand better what we're facing. We." The simple pronoun held such weight, such promise. Grace stared at him in wonder. "You still want to help us, knowing that Edward Blackwood will never stop looking, that he has money connections." Yates's jaw set in determination. "Let him come. This is my town. You and Emma are under my protection now if you want to be." The offer hung between them, breathtaking in its simplicity and its complexity. Grace searched his face, looking for any hint of hesitation, any shadow of doubt. She found only steadfast resolve and something that looked remarkably like love. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for us?" Yates smiled then, a gentle curve of his lips that reached his eyes and warmed them. "Because from the moment you walked into town with a baby and fear written all over your face, I knew you were the bravest person I'd ever met. And because every day since then, I've found new reasons to admire you." His voice softened. "And because I'm falling in love with you, Grace Simmons. With your strength, your determination, your gentle heart." The declaration, spoken so simply and directly, stole Grace's breath. Love was a luxury she had not allowed herself to consider, a risk she had deemed too great. And yet, standing in the cool October night, with music drifting around them and the man before her offering not just his protection but his heart, Grace found herself taking the greatest risk of all. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed her hand over his heart. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of Edward Blackwood, but of this, of trusting, of hoping." Yates covered her hand with his own, warm and steady. "Fear and courage often walk hand in hand, Grace. The question is which one we choose to follow." In answer, Grace rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his a gentle kiss, tentative and brief, but filled with promise. When she pulled back, Yates's expression was one of wonder and joy that mirrored her own tumultuous emotions. "I choose courage," she whispered. Yates's arms encircled her, drawing her closer as he bent to claim her lips again, this kiss deeper, a seal on unspoken promises and shared futures. In the circle of his embrace, Grace felt something she had almost forgotten: safety, yes, but also belonging. Home. When they finally parted, breathless and smiling, Yates pressed his forehead to hers. "We should go back inside before they send a search party." Grace laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. "Let them look. I'm exactly where I want to be." Hand in hand, they returned to the dance, where the speculation and whispers had already begun. But this time, Grace didn't mind the curious glances. Let them talk. Let them see. She had chosen courage over fear, trust over isolation. And as Yates led her into another waltz, his eyes never leaving hers, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. The weeks following the harvest dance passed in a blur of ordinary days made extraordinary by the growing bond between Grace and Yates. He became a regular visitor at the boarding house, joining Grace and Emma for supper several times a week. On Sundays, they attended church together, an official declaration of courtship that set the town's gossips atwater with approval. Emma, now approaching 6 months, had taken to Yates with surprising ease, reaching for him whenever he entered the room and falling asleep contentedly in his arms during quiet evenings on the boarding house porch. "She has good judgment, Mrs. Peterson declared one evening as she observed Yates gently rocking the sleeping infant. "Babies always know good souls." Grace, watching from her rocking chair, couldn't help but agree. The sight of her daughter so peaceful in Yates's strong arms made her heart swell with emotions she was only beginning to allow herself to feel fully: hope, contentment, and yes, love. For Yates had been right that night at the dance. Love and fear often walked hand in hand. But day by day, Grace was choosing love, choosing trust, choosing to believe in the possibility of a future where she and Emma were not just safe but happy. November brought the first real snow of the season, transforming Cottonwood Springs into a winter wonderland of white-capped buildings and pristine streets. Business at the general store slowed as the farmers and ranchers from outlying areas made fewer trips to town, giving Grace more time to prepare for the approaching Christmas season, the first she would celebrate with true joy since before her father's death. One crisp December afternoon, as Grace was arranging a display of Christmas candies, the bell above the store door jangled. She looked up with a welcoming smile that froze on her face as she recognized the man who entered. He was tall and distinguished, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as a man of means. His face, with its aristocratic features and cold gray eyes, was one she had hoped never to see again: Edward Blackwood. Grace's hands clutched the edge of the counter as terror washed through her in an icy wave. How had he found them? How had he tracked them to this remote town? "Grace," he greeted, his cultured voice carrying the same menacing undertone she remembered all too well. "How domestic you look." Playing shopkeeper in this charming little settlement, Grace fought to keep her voice steady. "What do you want, Edward?" he smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "I think you know exactly what I want, or rather who." He glanced around the store. "Where is my brother's child?" "Emma is my daughter," Grace said firmly, her protective instincts overriding her fear. "She has nothing to do with the Blackwoods." Edward's smile hardened. "We both know that's not true. She has Blackwood blood and she belongs with her family." He stepped closer to the counter, his voice dropping to a menacing murmur. "Did you really think I wouldn't find you, Grace? That I would allow my brother's murderer to raise his heir?" "Thomas was not Emma's father," Grace said, the words escaping before she could stop them. Something dangerous flashed in Edward's eyes. "So the rumors were true. You were unfaithful as well as murderous." He shrugged elegantly. "It hardly matters. In the eyes of the law, any child born during the marriage is legitimate. Emma is a Blackwood and she will be raised as such." Grace's mind raced, calculating the distance to the back room where Emma was napping, wondering if she could reach her before Edward. As if reading her thoughts, he shook his head slightly. "Don't do anything foolish, Grace. I have men outside. This can be civilized or it can be messy. Your choice." The bell above the door jangled again, and Grace's heart leapt with relief at the sight of Yates stepping into the store, his expression shifting immediately from casual to alert as he assessed the situation. "Afternoon," he said mildly, though his eyes were sharp as he moved to stand beside Grace. "Can I help you with something, mister?" Edward turned, studying the newcomer with cold assessment. "This is a private conversation, family business." "Is that so?" Yates replied, his hand casually moving to rest near his holstered gun. "Because it looked to me like you were threatening Miss Simmons." "Sheriff Keller," Grace said, the slight tremor in her voice betraying her fear. "This is Edward Blackwood, Thomas's brother." Understanding dawned in Yates's eyes, quickly followed by determination. He squared his shoulders, his stance subtly shifting to place himself more firmly between Grace and Edward. "Mr. Blackwood," he acknowledged, his tone hardening, "I believe your business here is concluded." Edward smiled thinly. "On the contrary, Sheriff, I've come to collect what rightfully belongs to the Blackwood family, my niece, Emma." "Emma belongs with her mother," Yates stated firmly. "The courts may see things differently," Edward countered smoothly. "Especially when they learn how my brother died." His cold gaze fixed on Grace. "I have witnesses who will testify that she murdered Thomas in cold blood, not in self-defense, as she no doubt claimed." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "That's a lie." "It's my word against yours," Edward shrugged. "And I assure you, my word carries significant weight with judges from here to St. Louis." He turned back to Yates. "I suggest you step aside, Sheriff. This doesn't concern you." Yates's expression remained impassive, but Grace could see the anger simmering beneath his controlled exterior. "Actually, it does concern me. Grace and Emma are residents of my town under my protection, and I don't take kindly to threats against my people." "Your people," Edward repeated, his eyebrows rising as his gaze moved between Yates and Grace. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by cold amusement. "I see. How touching. The gallant sheriff and the fugitive widow." His voice hardened. "It doesn't change anything. I will have the child one way or another." "Not in my town, you won't," Yates replied, his hand now resting openly on his gun. "I think it's time for you to leave, Mr. Blackwood." For a tense moment, Edward didn't move, his calculating gaze assessing Yates with new interest. Then he smiled, a chilling expression that made Grace shiver. "Very well, Sheriff. For now," he turned to Grace. "This isn't over, Grace, not by a long shot." With a slight bow, he added, "Give my regards to little Emma." With that, he turned and left the store, the bell jangling in his wake. Through the front window, Grace could see him speak briefly to two men waiting outside before all three mounted horses and rode slowly out of town. Only when they were out of sight did Grace's legs give way. Yates caught her before she could fall, guiding her to a chair behind the counter. "He found us," she whispered, her voice shaking. "After all this time, he found us." "It's all right," Yates said firmly, kneeling before her and taking her trembling hands in his. "He's gone for now and will be ready if he comes back." Grace shook her head, panic rising. "You don't understand. Edward Blackwood doesn't give up. He has money, influence. He'll use the courts, or if that fails, he'll use force." Her eyes filled with tears. "We have to leave, tonight." "No," Yates said, his voice gentle but unyielding. "Running isn't the answer, Grace, not anymore. We stand our ground. Together." "I can't risk Emma," she insisted. "And I won't let you face this alone," he countered. "Edward Blackwood isn't the only one with connections. I've got a few of my own." His thumbs traced soothing circles on the backs of her hands. "Trust me, Grace, please." The plea in his eyes, the steady warmth of his hands on hers, anchored her. Slowly, the panic receded, replaced by a tremulous resolve. "What do we do?" she asked. Yates smiled, relief evident in his expression. "First, we get you and Emma somewhere safe, then I send some telegrams." His expression hardened. Edward Blackwood isn't the only one who can influence judges. That evening found Grace, Emma, and Yates gathered in his small house on the edge of town, a modest but comfortable two-room structure that Grace had visited only once before. Mrs. Peterson had insisted on accompanying them, declaring that propriety must be maintained even in times of crisis. While Mrs. Peterson fussed over supper and Emma napped in a hastily arranged cradle, Yates outlined his plan to Grace. "I've sent telegrams to the territorial judge and to an old friend who practices law in St. Louis," he explained, spreading papers on the kitchen table. "But I think our best defense is a good offense." Grace looked up from the documents he had placed before her. "What do you mean?" "Marriage," Yates said simply. When Grace's eyes widened in surprise, he continued quickly. "Hear me out. As your husband, I'd have legal standing to protect both you and Emma. Edward Blackwood would have a much harder time making a case for custody against a stable home with two parents." Grace stared at him, her heart racing. "You're proposing marriage as a legal strategy." A flush crept up Yates's neck. "Not exactly." He reached across the table, taking her hand. "Grace, I've known since the day you walked into town that you were someone special. These past weeks have only confirmed what my heart knew from the start. I love you. And Emma. I want to build a life with you both, keep you safe, give you the happiness you deserve." His eyes, earnest and blue as the summer sky, held hers. "I was planning to ask you properly at Christmas. Had a ring ordered from Denver and everything." He smiled ruefully. "Edward Blackwood just forced my hand a bit." Grace's throat tightened with emotion. "Yates, I can't let you take on my troubles. This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment I fell in love with you," he replied simply. "And it's not just about protection, though God knows I'll do everything in my power to keep you and Emma safe. It's about family, the one we could build together." From the doorway, Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat pointedly. "If I might offer an observation," she said, her eyes twinkling despite the serious situation. "Love that can withstand this kind of storm is rare indeed. Don't be too proud to accept it when it's offered, Grace." For a long moment, Grace sat silently, her gaze moving between Yates's hopeful face and Mrs. Peterson's knowing smile. In her heart, she knew the answer, had known it perhaps since that night at the harvest dance, or even earlier when a tall sheriff had looked at a frightened woman with a baby and seen courage instead of desperation. "Yes," she said finally, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you, Yates Keller." The joy that bloomed in his eyes was answer enough to any lingering doubts. He rose and came around the table, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. "I promise you won't regret this," he murmured against her hair. "We'll face whatever comes together, Mrs. Peterson's enthusiastic clapping broke the moment, reminding them of her presence. "Well, this calls for celebration and planning. A Christmas wedding, perhaps," Grace laughed despite the gravity of the situation. "Is that enough time to make it legal before Edward returns?" Yates nodded, keeping an arm around her waist. "More than enough. We can have Reverend Thompson perform the ceremony this Sunday if needed." "This Sunday it is," Grace decided, a weight lifting from her shoulders despite the threat that still loomed. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't facing danger alone. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparations and precautions. Yates insisted that Grace and Emma stay at his house with Mrs. Peterson as chaperone, while he took turns with his deputy keeping watch for any sign of Edward Blackwood or his men. The town, upon learning of the situation, rallied around them with surprising unity. Mr. Hoffman closed the store early each day to escort Grace home himself. The blacksmith and several ranchers organized impromptu patrols of the town perimeter. And the women of Cottonwood Springs descended on Yates's small house with determination, cleaning and organizing and discussing wedding plans with an enthusiasm that almost but not quite overshadowed the reason for the hasty ceremony. On Saturday morning, a telegram arrived from Yates's lawyer friend in St. Louis. Yates read it with growing satisfaction. "Good news," he announced to Grace, who was helping Mrs. Peterson prepare lunch. "Edward Blackwood's influence may not be as far-reaching as he claimed. My friend has been making inquiries. Apparently, there were witnesses to Thomas's cruelty who are willing to testify on your behalf." Hope, cautious but real, blossomed in Grace's chest. "Truly?" Yates nodded, his expression serious but optimistic. "It won't be a simple battle, but we have solid ground to stand on. Your marriage to me, adoption papers for Emma, and testimony about Thomas's character and behavior will make it difficult for Edward to press his case." Grace sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the possibilities. "I never thought. I was so certain we'd have to run forever." Mrs. Peterson patted her shoulder reassuringly. "Sometimes the good Lord provides exactly what we need, exactly when we need it." She gave Yates an approving look, "even if it comes in the form of a stubborn lawman." Yates laughed, the sound warm and reassuring in the cozy kitchen. "I'll accept that description." He knelt beside Grace's chair, taking her hands in his. "One more day and you'll be Mrs. Keller. Then we face whatever comes together." "Together," Grace repeated, the word no longer frightening but fortifying. "I like the sound of that." Sunday dawned clear and cold, the December sun casting long shadows across the fresh snow that blanketed Cottonwood Springs. The church, decorated for the approaching Christmas season with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, was filled to capacity as word of the hasty wedding spread through town. In the small antechamber off the main sanctuary, Grace stood before a borrowed mirror, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. Mrs. Hoffman had insisted on lending Grace her own wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of ivory satin with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her auburn hair was arranged in soft curls, crowned with a circlet of holly berries and winter greenery in lieu of the traditional orange blossoms. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Peterson declared, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She cradled Emma, who had been dressed in a new white gown made by the town's seamstress especially for the occasion. Absolutely radiant, Grace smoothed the unfamiliar fabric with trembling hands. "I'm nervous," she admitted. "Not about marrying Yates, but about everything that comes after." Mrs. Peterson's expression softened with understanding. "Marriage is always a leap of faith, dear, even without the complications you're facing. But that man out there loves you with his whole heart. That's a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Mr. Hoffman entered, looking uncomfortable but proud in his Sunday best. "It's time," he announced, offering his arm. "If you're ready, Mrs. Simmons." Grace took a deep breath, accepting his arm with a grateful smile. When she had mentioned that she had no one to give her away, Mr. Hoffman had volunteered immediately, declaring it his duty as her employer and friend. The small church fell silent as the door opened, and Grace appeared on Mr. Hoffman's arm. Every eye turned to watch her progress down the narrow aisle, but Grace saw only Yates, waiting for her at the altar. He stood tall and proud in a new black suit, his blue eyes never leaving her face as she approached. The love and admiration in his gaze gave Grace the courage each step required, carrying her forward to the future they would build together. As she reached him and placed her hand in his, Reverend Thompson smiled benevolently at the assembled congregation. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice filling the small church, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Yates Keller and Grace Simmons in holy matrimony." The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the traditional vows taking on special significance given the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. When Yates slipped a simple gold band onto Grace's finger, the ring he had ordered from Denver arrived just in time. His hands were steady and sure, a testament to the certainty of his commitment. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Thompson declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The words rang with significance beyond the traditional blessing. As Yates bent to claim his bride with a tender kiss, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers, a community united in support of the new family. The celebration that followed at the town hall was a testament to the spirit of Cottonwood Springs, tables groaning with food contributed by every household, music provided by local fiddlers, and an atmosphere of determined festivity, despite the shadow that had necessitated the hasty wedding. As Grace and Yates circled the floor in their first dance as husband and wife, she leaned close to whisper, "Thank you for everything." Yates's arm tightened around her waist. "No thanks needed. This is where we were always headed, Grace. Edward Blackwood just hurried us along." She laughed softly at that, her heart lighter than it had been in years despite the challenges that still lay ahead. "Still, it's not the peaceful beginning most couples hope for. Peace is overrated," Yates replied with a wink. "I prefer a wife with courage enough to face whatever comes our way." The celebration continued well into the evening, with Emma passed from one admiring townswoman to another, each cooing over the baby who had, in many ways, brought this day about by arriving in town in her mother's arms months before. As the party began to wind down, Yates drew Grace aside, his expression suddenly serious. "I've just received word from my deputy, riders approaching from the east, 3 men. Grace's heart leapt to her throat. "Edward, possibly," Yates admitted. "I need to go check. Stay here with Emma. The whole town will keep you safe." Before he could leave, Grace caught his arm. "No, we face this together, remember? That was the promise." Yates hesitated, then nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Together, then. But Emma stays here with Mrs. Peterson." After ensuring the baby was contentedly nestled in Mrs. Peterson's capable arms, Grace and Yates made their way to the sheriff's office, which offered a clear view of the eastern approach to town. As they watched, 3 riders emerged from the gathering dusk, their figures growing clearer as they approached. "It's him," Grace confirmed, recognizing Edward's distinctive posture even at a distance. "With his men." Yates's jaw set with determination. "Let them come, we're ready." As Edward and his companions rode down the main street, they were met by an unexpected sight, not just the sheriff waiting on the steps of his office, but a significant portion of the town's population, gathered in silent support behind their lawman and his new bride. Edward reined in his horse, his cold gaze taking in the scene with calculated assessment. "Quite the welcoming committee, Sheriff," he observed, dismounting with fluid grace. His eyes narrowed as he noticed Grace standing beside Yates. "And the blushing bride, I see." "Congratulations are in order, apparently, Mr. Blackwood," Yates acknowledged evenly. "You've returned sooner than expected." "I'm not a man who wastes time," Edward replied, his gaze never leaving Grace. "Where is my niece?" "My daughter is safe," Grace said firmly, drawing strength from Yates's solid presence beside her and the community at her back. "And she's staying with me and my husband." Edward's lips curved in a cold smile. "Husband, how convenient, but it changes nothing, Grace. A hastily arranged marriage won't erase what you did to Thomas." "I know exactly what I did," Grace replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I defended myself against a cruel man who had already killed once that night. There are witnesses who will testify to Thomas's true nature, Mr. Blackwood. Your influence can't silence all of them." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Edward's face before his composure returned. "Courts tend to favor blood relations when it comes to children," he stated, "especially when the mother is of questionable character." "Courts also consider the welfare of the child above all else," Yates interjected, "and they look favorably on stable homes with two parents, especially when one of those parents is an officer of the law with an unblemished reputation." He stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Let me be clear, Blackwood, you're not taking Emma. Not today, not ever. You can pursue this through legal channels if you want, but you'll lose, and if you try any other approach." He let the implication hang in the air, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered gun. For a tense moment, the two men locked gazes, measuring each other's resolve. Then, surprisingly, Edward laughed a short, humorless sound. "You've chosen an interesting protector, Grace," he observed. "A man willing to risk everything for a woman he barely knows. A man who recognizes courage and truth when he sees it," Yates corrected, "and who knows what family really means." Something shifted in Edward's expression, not defeat exactly, but a reassessment. He glanced around at the townspeople gathered behind Grace and Yates, their faces set with determined solidarity. "This isn't over," he said finally, though there was less conviction in his voice than before. "I'll be watching and waiting. If anything happens to that child under your care—" "Nothing will," Grace interrupted firmly, "because unlike the Blackwoods, we understand that children are not property. They're treasures to be protected and loved." Edward's jaw tightened at the direct challenge, but after a moment he inclined his head slightly. "We'll see." He turned to remount his horse, adding over his shoulder, "Enjoy your honeymoon, such as it is. I'll be seeing my lawyers in Denver." With that, he and his men rode out of town, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the gathering darkness. Only when they were out of sight did Grace release the breath she had been holding, leaning against Yates as the tension drained from her body. "He's not giving up," she murmured. "No," Yates agreed, his arm secure around her waist. "But neither are we." The townspeople pressed around them, offering congratulations on both the wedding and the confrontation, their support unwavering despite the threat that still loomed. In their faces, Grace saw something she had almost forgotten existed: community, belonging, home. As they made their way back to the town hall to collect Emma and thank their guests, Yates leaned down to whisper in Grace's ear, "Still think you made the right choice, Mrs. Keller." Grace looked up at him, at the man who had seen courage in a frightened woman and had offered not just protection but love. "The best choice of my life," she replied with absolute certainty. And as they stepped into the warm light of the hall, where Emma waited in the circle of friends who had become family, Grace knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together with courage enough for anything. Spring arrived in Cottonwood Springs with a riot of wildflowers and the promise of new beginnings. The winter had passed peacefully, with no further appearance by Edward Blackwood, though Yates's contacts reported that he had indeed consulted lawyers in Denver and St. Louis. Their advice, apparently, had been discouraging enough that he had retreated to his estates to reconsider his approach. For Grace and Yates, the months had been a time of building not just the addition to Yates's small house that would serve as Emma's nursery, but the foundations of their life together. The adjustment to marriage had been surprisingly easy, as if they had been moving toward this partnership from the moment Grace had walked into town. Emma, now a robust 10-month-old with a winning smile and Yates's blue eyes, had begun to crawl with determined energy, exploring every corner of their home and attempting to pull herself up on any available furniture. Her first word, to Grace's delight and Yates's unbridled pride, had been a clear acknowledgment of the man who had embraced the role of father with wholehearted devotion. The legal adoption had been finalized in February, officially making Emma a Keller rather than a Simmons or a Blackwood. The territorial judge, a friend of Yates's from his early days in Dakota, had been sympathetic to their situation and expedited the process. With each legal document filed, each official stamp of approval, the shadow of Edward Blackwood receded further from their lives. On a particularly fine April morning, Grace stood on the porch of their home, watching as Yates demonstrated the fine points of horseshoe tossing to an attentive Emma, who sat on a blanket in the yard, clapping her hands at each successful throw. "She's going to be throwing those herself by summer," Yates predicted, joining Grace on the porch with Emma in his arms. Grace laughed, taking her daughter and pressing a kiss to her rounded cheek. "I wouldn't be surprised. She's determined to do everything early." "Like her mother," Yates observed with a smile, his arm sliding around Grace's waist as they gazed out at the town spread below them. From their vantage point on the hill, they could see the bustling Main Street, the church spire, and beyond, the vast prairie stretching to the horizon. "I've been thinking," Grace said after a moment. "It's time I went back to work, not at the store perhaps, but something. Mr. Thompson mentioned the school board is looking for a teacher for the fall term." Yates studied her face, his expression thoughtful. "You'd enjoy that, I think. You have a natural way with children." "I would," Grace agreed, "and it would be good for Emma to see her mother doing something meaningful, contributing to the community that has given us so much." Yates pressed a kiss to her temple. "Whatever you want to do, I support you, always." The simple declaration, so freely given, still had the power to move Grace after months of marriage. The unconditional support, the partnership they had built, was a daily gift she never took for granted. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I love you." Emma, sensing the emotional moment, patted Grace's face with a chubby hand, demanding attention. Both adults laughed, the sound carrying on the spring breeze. As they stood on the porch of the home they had built together, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fear that had driven her into Cottonwood Springs, the courage it had taken to stay, the trust she had learned to give, and the love that had blossomed from that trust. Edward Blackwood might someday return. Challenges would certainly arise. But with Yates beside her and Emma in her arms, Grace faced the future not with fear, but with confidence. She had walked into town with a baby and fear, and found a man who had seen beyond her terror to the strength beneath. "You've got courage enough," he had told her that first day. He had been right, and together they had courage enough for whatever lay ahead.